Hello! Today I'm returning to the Metal Gear Solid saga, and having reviewed the first three Metal Gear Solid titles at length, we now arrive at what was the much anticipated PlayStation 3 release, Metal Gear Solid 4, Guns of the Patriots. Now, this title was momentous for a number of reasons. Firstly, it was Metal Gear Solid's debut on what was then the current gen flagship PlayStation 3, but secondly, and perhaps more importantly for fans, it promised the continuity of Solid Snake's story after a 7-year hiatus since Metal Gear Solid 2, and indeed a 4-year gap since the last numerical game, which was Metal Gear Solid 3, which explored, of course, the Big Boss origin story, so was a departure from the mainline Solid Snake story. So, as I have done with previous MGS discussions, I think it's important to contextualise and appreciate the time and place and how highly anticipated this game was at the time, because I think it had a direct impact on its critical response, and as with Metal Gear Solid 2, it had quite a divisive fan response to the continuity and the conclusion of Solid Snake's story, which I'll break down over the course of this episode. Now, before delving into story, character and gameplay, I'd like to kick off with a discussion of the setting and the narrative context of the game, because I think it's crucial to understanding what a departure, but also in many respects what an extension and logical conclusion perhaps Metal Gear Solid 4 was when compared to the games that came before it. And what I mean by that is that looking at Metal Gear Solid 1 and Metal Gear Solid 3, there is an attentiveness to real-world history, real-world political events, organisations and figures that formed the narrative foundations and the setting of those games. And as discussed in those respective reviews, Metal Gear Solid 1 and Metal Gear Solid 3 were beautifully woven in with real-world events to offer this slight suspension of disbelief and perhaps plausibility to the game events and the characters therein, with, for example, mentions of East-West relations, the Cold War, the tumultuous geopolitics of the 20th century, which informed so much of the story and, of course, helped legitimise much of the espionage action that was taking place, because, of course, our protagonists are Black Ops operatives after all. However, throughout these games, and particularly Metal Gear Solid 1, and shifting into Metal Gear Solid 2, we also had the sci-fi, the futurism and the technological at play that amplified as the series wore on, whether that was the genome soldiers, the advanced use of nanomachines and the Patriots AI, and all of this came to a climactic payoff in the dystopian world of Metal Gear Solid 4 and the bleak technology-driven war economy that plays out here. And actually, I do find in retrospect that one of the broader themes of the games captured in the character of Solid Snake is this conflict and conflation between past and future, where even as early as Metal Gear Solid 1, Snake is increasingly finding himself placeless in the world and a relic of the Cold War or the post-Cold War, and by the time that Metal Gear Solid 4 rolls around, he's back on the battlefield but finds himself outmoded in the face of the rampant and ever-advancing modes of tech and warfare. And a prime example of this is the proliferation of Metal Gears around the world, when they were once this singular, unique obstacle for Snake to overcome, like Metal Gear Rex, for example. They are now all over the place, but I will unpack that a little more later. But suffice to say, looking at the series and where we arrived by the end, by Metal Gear Solid 4, it's a very interesting arc when looked at from a purely advancing technological warfare sort of perspective. And as is the case with a lot of Kojima's work, and particularly within the Metal Gear series, beyond the absurdism in some of these concepts, there remains this grain of plausibility as well. And much like the work of George Orwell or Huxley, you can look at the grim dystopias that were crafted in 1984 or Brave New World, and also Metal Gear Solid, I think, and vaguely see how this horrifying authoritarian world may indeed come to pass, whether it's the concept of Big Brother or the diminishing human agency in an AI-run world that Kojima has envisaged here. Now, I suppose, finally, on the context of the game, before we go a little bit deeper, is the fact that this title exists at all, and what Kojima was attempting to do with it, because it's generally accepted that he was quite reluctant to make Metal Gear Solid 2, let alone Metal Gear Solid 4, and felt that the cliffhanger with the demise of Solidus in the second game was enough to conclude the contemporary story, with the later MGS3, of course, being a prequel which helped change our perceptions of Big Boss, of Ocelot, and so on, rather than expand on this future narrative. And for my part, I am someone that loves cliffhangers. I like ambiguous stories that force audiences to sort of read between the lines or draw their own conclusions, with movies like The Italian Job or In Bruges and the original Blade Runner being prime examples of where we, the audience, are left guessing. But even as someone who's open to those sorts of stories, as a Metal Gear Solid fan, I felt that Sons of Liberty did need a sequel because there were so many loose ends and so many unanswered questions for the player. And just thinking back to that excellent post-credits dialogue sequence where Otacon mentions that the Patriots we've been looking for died over 100 years ago. I mean, that was a fantastic, chilling hook that, at least for me, kind of screamed out for a sequel, because there wasn't much in the game that really told us what that meant. And thus, for the player, I think it would have been quite frustrating for such an abstract statement to conclude the series. So, yes, there were threads of story that warranted concluding, and Metal Gear Solid 4 was quite comprehensive, and indeed some might say a little too comprehensive, in concluding that. And its fan service and its drawing together of all these threads of characters and stories from previous games, with one of the most amusing summaries that I've seen of this, has described it as a beautiful mess of a game. And I can understand why someone might draw that conclusion, because Metal Gear Solid 4 not only drew together tangent threads from Metal Gear Solid 2, such as Rose, Naomi, Roy Campbell, Olga's child, Sonny, and all of these kind of peripheral characters, but it also drew in prequel characters and elements of Snake Eater as well, such as Ava, Zero, Big Boss, and so on. And so, while some of this was good, and actually I think one of the best moments in the game, for example, was the nostalgic return to Shadow Moses, I also can't help but think that Kojima was being somewhat cynical in his approach here. And while nobody sets out to make a beautiful mess of a game, I think both Metal Gear Solid 2 and Metal Gear Solid 4, being his reluctant sequels as they were, have a touch of cynical humour about them and purposeful narrative verboseness about them when looked at a certain way. And while I do love Metal Gear Solid 4, probably one of my favourite PlayStation 3 games, I can understand why some fans have criticised it in the past. So with that in mind, let's move forward into the context of the game now and see how they shaped this story around its characters, past and present. Now, turning to Metal Gear Solid 4's story and its gameplay, we arrive to the game resuming control of Solid Snake, which is something that fans had been longing for quite literally years by this point. Yet much like Metal Gear Solid 2, which curved-balled us with Raiden being the unexpected protagonist and player character, rather than simply giving in to fans' desires to play as this current generation, unadulterated Solid Snake, Kojima decided to accelerate the age of Snake, making him this geriatric version of himself and the soldier that we once knew. And this not only has implications on gameplay, because we see his stamina wear down constantly, we see his muscles cramp if we do anything too acrobatic, and this sort of thing, but it also ties in with this aforementioned theme of making Snake appear outmoded in the mechanised theatre of war that he now finds himself in, and his interactions, particularly with legacy characters like Meryl, who by now is a competent, battle-tested warrior who has retained her youth and her looks. It really serves to emphasise this gulf between Snake and the new world, and I really quite like that, actually, once I'd got over the initial shock of seeing him aged up so radically. And actually it was quite bittersweet to see how Meryl's relationship to Snake jarringly transitioned from this potential romantic interest in Metal Gear Solid 1 to a sort of forlorn, almost father-daughter relationship instead. Beginning the game, we also get onboarded to a new array of gameplay and technology, and for example, the stealth camouflage, which was once a sought-after, unlockable asset in earlier titles, has been conflated with the camo mechanics of Metal Gear Solid 3 to create the Octa Camo sneaking suit, which is a huge element of the stealth approach to this game, and something quite innovative that I really quite enjoyed. We have the Solid Eye, which combines earlier items, such as night vision goggles, binoculars, and so on, into one kind of standalone device. And we have the unique Metal Gear Mark II, which is a small, portable mobile unit that we can control and drive around the environment to gather intelligence. So some quite interesting developments taking place there that fits with the futurism and the dystopia of this particular game world. Beyond this, we also have the weapon ID system, which once again serves as a gameplay obstacle to obtaining or at least unlocking the weapons that we collect. And this is great because it once again has implications on the dystopian story and the development of the Patriot AI that is determining things here. And some of the more momentous cutscenes that we see later, such as when Ocelot's surrounded aboard his ship in a nighttime sting, only to turn the PMC's weapons on themselves, it leans directly into this narrative and gameplay element of the weapons ID system. So certainly one of the more absurd elements of Metal Gear Solid 4's setting, but I did like it, and I think it emphasised one of the key themes, chilling feelings about this entire dystopian world that Kojima has crafted, which is that feeling of a lack of control, a lack of choice, and lack of self-determinism that I think has run, subtly or not, through the core story of Metal Gear Solid ever since the first game, and has finally come to fruition with this automated, embattled world of Metal Gear Solid 4. So that's the futuristic context of the game and the broad strokes setting. And looking briefly to the actual physical setting, as in the environments that we operate in, I really liked how this dystopian concept played out across a wide array of environments, because we've seen the futuristic military bases of Metal Gear Solid 1 and 2, we've seen the leafy wilderness of Metal Gear Solid 3, which were quite homogeneous and singular environments for those game worlds. But now, as if to emphasise the sprawling influence of the Patriots conflict, Metal Gear Solid 4 showcases a broad range of locations, from the proxy-ridden Middle East and South America to the espionage scenarios of Eastern Europe, and of course the emotive return, the Shadow Moses, which I will touch on shortly. And thinking about the settings, it is interesting how the game was structured and split up into separate acts and scenarios between these locations. And in something of a precursor to Metal Gear Solid 5 in a lot of ways, we have a mobile base that's manned by Otacon and Sunny, which is mainly seen in briefing and debriefing cutscenes between acts. And then Snake is sort of picked up and dropped off at new locations for whatever his mission and whatever the act might be. So this is quite a departure from the survivalist mono-scenario structure of the first three games, where you are dropped behind enemy lines and sort of figure your way through a single setting, a single stream of circumstances as you go. And I can't stress enough how innovative this was at the time. It was not something that Metal Gear Solid had really done before from a sort of setting and gameplay perspective. So I quite liked the episodic structure of MGS4. Quite interesting, and personally, while the game was both criticised and remarked upon as a spectacle for its very indulgent cutscenes between its missions, which largely consists of Otacon and Snake talking, I did quite enjoy it. I did enjoy that classic Kojima tactic of using interactivity and Easter eggs to compel interested players to stay in these cutscenes. And while it was verbose at times, I think if you love the characters, if you love the history and the abstract, weird lore of the Metal Gear Solid universe, then there were definitely several aspects of these cutscenes that were really quite worth it. and rewarding for the player. So moving on, as mentioned, we have the Octa Camo and various attributes conflated from earlier games that add to the gameplay of Metal Gear Solid 4. But right from the outset, we have a very different feel for the game, where action is advocated as much, if not more so, than the potential for sneaking. And indeed, while the game retained the official slogan of tactical espionage action, it also received the unofficial motto of nowhere to hide. And compared to earlier titles, Metal Gear Solid 4 sees Snake dropped into an active war zone, with PMCs and militias running around, a testament to the Patriot AI's forever wars. And so it's interesting how player determinate the means of progression was, where you can stand and fight your way through a scenario, or indeed attempt to sneak through, depending on your preferences and how you want to rank at the end of the game. And I feel the renewed encouragement of action is emphasised in a few ways compared to earlier titles, such as allowing Snake to operate mortars, machine gun turrets, and so on the battlefield, but also by introducing the character of Drebin, the arms dealer, who holds a massive unlockable arsenal of weapons for Snake, which errs towards the loud, the automated heavy metal of a war zone, rather than the traditional silenced SOCOM sort of weapons and the stuff that you procure on site in previous games. So a radically different setup and implications for gameplay here that nonetheless do maintain a reward system for stealth, which I do err towards, at least on my first playthrough. But I did find it much more challenging in this particular game, where you have so many NPCs sort of running all over the place. Now, coming finally to story, this is where Metal Gear Solid 4 is regarded by many as a beautiful mess. Consciously so, maybe, but it serves at once as a nostalgia trip for players who might delight in seeing Merrill, Mei Ling, Raiden, and Colonel Campbell again, along with Cold War era Snake Eater characters such as Ava, Zero, and of course Big Boss, which creates quite an unwieldy set of stories and timelines to pull together in a cohesive and conclusive narrative. Beyond this, we also have the New Era story, which is a world of widely proliferated Metal Gears, and really, as I mentioned, the fruition of this elusive Patriot AI sort of concept that was set up and hinted at throughout Metal Gear Solid 2. So, as we know, Hideo Kojima wanted to end Metal Gear Solid, and you can almost feel that by the way he's thrown together the old and the new Solid Snake, Ava, Ocelot, Big Boss, Vamp, all these characters together. He was trying to provide, whether contrived or not, a totality to the story's conclusion, an epic sprawl of cameos, unexpected reveals and showdowns, from Raiden's ostentatious fight scenes with Vamp to Snake and Ava's motorcycle chase that recalls the closing moments of Snake Eater. And to be honest, for the most part, I was there for it. I really enjoyed the variety, despite it veering between the nostalgic and the improbable and the goofy. And a prime example of it being at its nostalgic best was the return to Shadow Moses Island, which was brilliantly rendered into the graphics of the day. And such was the nostalgia that the once fearsome final boss of Metal Gear Solid, Metal Gear Rex, is encountered as something more like an old friend than an adversary. And indeed, it becomes a temporary vehicle that we can operate and battle Ocelot in yet another nostalgia-inducing battle between the MGS1 era Metal Gear Rex and MGS2 era Metal Gear Ray. So that segment was definitely one of my favourite moments of the game. And indeed, the initial return to Shadow Moses as the snowstorm clears, we have the original soundtrack, The Best Is Yet to Come, playing. And that moment was probably one of my top 10 moments in gaming, ever. Even though it was pure fan service, it was really beautiful how they composed and structured that introduction scenario to Shadow Moses. And yet, conversely to that, and these sort of poignant moments, we have some aspects of the game, such as the reveal that Ava is Solid Snake's mother, Raiden battling with a katana in his teeth and between his toes after he loses his arms, and all of this sort of crazy stuff that we sort of have to suspend our disbelief for. It was where the game felt a little bit too goofy for some players. But as a long-time player of Metal Gear Solid, I would argue that the particular vibe of the series has always straddled the emotive and the sincere with the absurd since at least the 1998 game. And actually, the final battle against Liquid Ocelot on top of Outer Haven, which flits its way between references to all of the previous games, and indeed the relationship between Ocelot, Liquid, Big Boss and Snake, perfectly captures, in my opinion, this balance between the humour and the absurdity of the games, with that more emotive side of the saga. And again, definitely one of my favourite boss fights in this game and gaming in general, in the way that it pays homage, but ultimately concludes the saga quite climactically with this pivotal character arc of Revolver Ocelot, who has proved one of the most compelling villains, anti-heroes, and muddling characters in game history, finally meeting his end. Now, I suppose a byproduct of making all these nostalgic nods to important early characters and concluding their respective story arcs is that the newer characters and the newer villains don't seem to matter as much as previous titles. And where, for example, the advocates of Dead Cell in Metal Gear Solid 2 had their own agenda and their own interrelationships, such as Vamp and Fortune, and of course Solidus Snake, the Beauty and the Beast unit serve as a standalone and somewhat salacious facsimile of the MGS1 unit, Foxhound, with clear references to the respective codenames of Wolf, Mantis, and so on, along with boss fights that in some cases replicate what had come before in the earlier game, such as the Snowfield sniper battle with Wolf. And again, these have been criticised by some fans for their lack of meaningful emotional proximity to the story, but I think appreciating them for what they are, which is periodically cool boss fights, a bit of exposition fluff from Drebin afterwards, is enough to make them feel relevant here. And everything from the Raven battle in the Clock Tower to the Mantis battle in Outer Haven were excellent moments of the game, I think. And I think the reason the Beauty and the Beast unit don't matter so much as individuals as opposed to being nods back to Foxhound is that everything in this game is geared towards being the epilogue and the last stand of Solid Snake's story. And while, yes, it does feature and conclude Ocelot and Big Boss's arc too, and arguably you could look at Guns of the Patriots in two key ways, which is the Ocelot arc conclusion or the Snake arc conclusion, I nonetheless lean towards the weight of the game being on Snake's conclusion, because virtually everything in Guns of the Patriots is a tribute and a callback not only to the significant moments in Snake's story, but also how things have radically changed since then. So for example, the Beauty and the Beast unit are a nod back to Foxhound, but they are an extremely advanced, technologically updated version of it. Raiden has evolved from Snake's naive rookie comrade in Sons of Liberty to be conflated with a phantomish copy of his dead ally, Grey Fox, in this cyborg ninja, image. And Meryl, like in Metal Gear Solid 1, is an ally that he encounters on the battlefield, but rather than love blooming on the battlefield or him mentoring her as an out-of-depth rookie, it's almost the other way around, where she's constantly cajoling him and critiquing him because of his age and his ability in this new and modern world. So I'm quite convinced that it's primarily Solid Snake's farewell in the most symbolic, if verbose, and scorched earth way possible on the part of Kojima's writing. And coming to the conclusion of that, which again many felt was just narrative what the fuckery, was the reveal of Big Boss being alive and having a lengthy hour-plus redemptive monologue between him and Solid Snake. And once more, it's just in keeping with this fine balance of the emotive and the absurd, because to think of the Metal Gear Solid saga without Solid Snake and Big Boss coming face to face once more, it does seem like it would be a missed opportunity if that weren't to happen. But on the flip side, the sheer narrative gymnastics of body doubles and hidden survivors and Zero and Ava, it's just that much more we need to suspend our disbelief for. And while the earlier titles balanced their absurdities with a certain groundedness in historical accuracy or relatable real-world politics or character dilemmas, Guns of the Patriots being this dystopian future full of a cast of improbable characters, it's just a fever dream of a game that's the most untethered from reality in the entire Metal Gear Solid series. But once more, I want to stress that that is not a bad thing. I think that even in the absurd, we have the essence of Metal Gear Solid shine through, the themes and the meta that underpin each game and elevates them above so many other titles. And I think where it counts, such as Solid's showdown with Ocelot, his interactions with Raiden and Meryl, even of course Otacon and Sonny, and his symbolic selflessness and sacrifices in moments like where we are forcing him to crawl through that microwaving, heating up corridor, we can see the emotive genius of the games shine through, and this synergy of narrative and dialogue and gameplay kind of come to pass. So it is a very patchworked game that hinges perhaps more on its engaging gameplay than its lengthy cutscenes. And I think on subsequent playthroughs, many of us may not find the cutscenes quite as demanding of our attention as the first time round. But that said, I don't think that Kojima set out to purposefully sabotage or make a narratively poor game, which it has previously been accused of. And I want to stress that I don't think Metal Gear Solid 4 is narratively poor. But what is clear is that he wanted to, as I say, scorch the earth for all plausible theories, questions, and indeed continuities for the core set of characters that he's crafted since the first Metal Gear Solid. So Ocelot, Big Boss, and Solid, and most of the characters that kind of contributed or orbited their stories are concluded here, with the exception of Raiden and a handful of others. So I suppose the question remains for many is, could it have been written and structured in a way that included all of these characters and stories without being quite so muddling? An interesting thing to consider, I'm not sure. But ultimately, I do think Metal Gear Solid 4 earns its acclaim. I think it rightly sits alongside the first trilogy of games as a faithful conclusion to the harrowing, complex world of Patriot AI systems, running everything in this mad dystopia, and the conclusion of Zero and Big Boss appearing, on paper at least, that brings it full circle, and it does make sense, everything that had been built up over the course of the series. Additionally, the gameplay, with its full camera controls and updated mechanics and gadgets, is also at the apex of what this series was able to achieve in terms of immersive, enjoyable stealth, action and combat. And while Metal Gear Solid 5 went a step further and took things in a slightly different direction, I think Guns of the Patriots is on the whole, if not within the individual detail, a solid conclusion to the Solid Snake story. So there we have it. If you got this far, thanks very much for listening. Kudos to you. I have discussed Metal Gear Solid in the past, only sparingly, with broad reviews of the games, which I'll link to in the description. But it is definitely in my top 3 game series of all time, and I may look at doing more involved discussions of individual characters or themes or so on in the future. Finally, if you enjoyed the episode, please consider sharing, subscribing, and drop a comment below to let me know your thoughts on this conclusive instalment for Solid Snake.